I started scouting. Every Saturday morning I'd cycle down to Botany Bay and scout around on my bicycle thinking about where I could paint. Because when I paint en plein air, I really don't want to make an exhibition of myself. I don't want to attract too much attention. So initially last year I found spots where I could see the container wall from the eastern suburb cemetery. So I'd sit in the older section, more rundown section of the cemetery, and look. I did quite a few paintings of actually the gravestones at the cranes beyond them. And then I found another spot amongst the old foundations of the Bunurong power station that used to be there, right on the edge of the new cemetery, and I'd actually go park near all the new gravestones and just go over the lip of the cemetery and paint the container wall from there. But that spot wasn't too good because the guys who do all the grass clearing and clipping in the cemetery come up in a little bobcat and they tip all the grass clippings over the edge, and one day they tipped a whole load of grass clippings and weeds right next to me, and the painting got covered in stuff, and they didn't notice I was there, and I wasn't going to make a fuss because it was not, you know, I was just right under the lip of where they tipped their bobcat. So, and then I found that there was a really good view of the containers from Foreshore Drive that they've just recently been doing. They're building a whole new container wall, and they've done all new landscaping along Foreshore Drive. You can't stop your car there, it's no stopping. So I worked out that I could park near the golf course in Joseph Banks Park and walk around the edge of the golf course, carrying the skier that I brought with me, and then I'd cross the very busy road at Foreshore Drive, and within a 100-metre stretch I painted about 25 paintings of the containers. I just kept doing it as long as I was excited by the project, and I didn't want to repeat myself. So eventually, I think I've stopped painting the containers now, but I think I did probably about 35 paintings from that 100-yard strip, and I probably have kept about 20 of them. It was also like a race against time because they had these giant polythene pipes there, which a sprinkling system to encourage all the new plantings they put in there, the new landscaping, and I never knew when they were going to go off, and they had these giant, you know, like a sprinkler in a garden's like this. These were big ones that went, and I'd hear this noise and I'd go, oh God, and I'd run up, but I had a big roll of gaffer tape in a plastic bag, and I'd run up and I'd throw the plastic bag over the top of the sprinkler and wrap gaffer tape around it, and then it would be going inside the bag, yeah. So, and I kept painting it. So you have to have everything with you and be prepared. I'm just going to show you my gear here now. Shall I put that in?
Or just put it down.
I'll just put it down. This is a bag from my art supply shop, a bit of a free ad, which I just, inside here I carry panels of various sizes. This is one of the panels that typical of what I painted those ones on. I found all these second-hand, nice, quite thin wooden panels at a place called the Bower in Marrickville, a recycling place. Often I use the sides of old drawers. I look for, when they do council cleanups, I look for old wardrobes in the street and I pull out the drawers. I also look at the grain on the side of the panel. If it's going like this, it's good, it means it won't cut in the sun, but if the grain is going like that, it means it's cut out of a different part of the log, and when you actually prime it and take it out in the strong sunlight, it can often warp. So, but this is probably 30, 40-year-old pine, so it's pretty stable, nice and straight. I painted this one. I normally work on a white ground, but I've been doing some nocturnes lately, so I prime them a pale blue before I start. So basically I've got all my paint panels of different sizes there, and my little floppy white hat, which Jan says she won't walk next to me in because it's so baggy. I've got masking tape, so when I get back to the car, or sometimes I tape two pictures together. If I do two pictures the same size and they're wet, I get a little twig and I put it in each corner and I tape them really tight together, and then I can, say if I'm in the bush, I can walk out with the paintings taped together the same size and they don't touch. There's an airspace in between them. I also carry, you know, in the summer, the Airguard, sunscreen. And sunscreen's actually really good for getting oil paint off your fingers. So this is one of these webbing bags made in India, I think, which are good because the terps doesn't dissolve them. If I had a plastic backpack, the terps would eat a hole in it. You ever put terps in a yogurt container? It goes straight through. So I'm just going to show you this. About every week I renew my palette because it starts to get a real skin on it. It starts to dry out. Depends on the different colours. I've made this box myself. It's got, inside it's got things like ski bottoms or something to stop the palette flipping against the other side, and I just use this little pair of pliers to pull it out, and there it is. That's my palette that I use. On the one side I've got an opaque white, and that's a transparent white, zinc white, titanium white. I used to use flake white, but it's poisonous, and I stopped using it recently. And then I have different purples, and through the reds, the yellows are starting to get a bit squished up, so maybe I should start to move them out. But I tend to keep the colours in the same place, because then I can look up and be painting, and I can almost push the brush towards a certain colour and know exactly where it is. So when I'm painting, I've been trying to paint these nocturnes lately, and the light's not very good, so I like to, if I've got this palette, I really know where all the colours are, and it comes to a point when it's getting dark, you can only really see the tones, but because I know where I put my brush, I sort of know what colour it is too. So I have quite a lot of blues here: cerulean, ultramarine, cobalt, and phthalo blue, and then some mixed greys. I used to have these in my palette, but when I went to Melbourne to do the building site job, I found it really sped things up if I had some pre-mixed tertiary colours in my palette. I carry a lot of brushes with me so that I can work quickly and not waste time actually washing the same brush all the time. So I keep them in just a roll of old towel, and this is not nearly as many as I normally have because they're sitting in tubs at home today. But I normally have about 40, all different sizes. I use these, you know, wedged ones and long-handled sables, and I've usually got bigger, one or two really big ones in there as well. So I just roll them up and put them in there like that. In the front of the bag, I've got 2 tins for turps. One gets dirtier than the other one, so that's to wash my brushes. I've got one of these little things to put my medium in on the palette, and I have this is an oily medium, and this is a lean medium, and I use that more. I don't paint with particularly shiny, but I paint in a way that's called alla prima. I do it all in one go, and with these paintings, everything was moving around so fast that the containers would be shuffling up and down on their tracks, so nothing stayed the same during a 1.5 to 2 hour period. So all my container paintings were done in about 1.5 hours. I went as fast as I could, and I had to make decisions about where I was going to put things after they'd moved. And sometimes if a big crane moved, I'd rub out what I'd done and change it. Sometimes I think I'll leave it there and I'll just work around that fact. And then the weather, of course, changes. The clouds come past. But usually I find painting a landscape, there's a sort of 2 hour time frame in which you can paint, after which the light has really changed too much, the shadows have moved, except sometimes on a very grey sort of day. That's about all. I've moved on from cranes now. I'm sort of trying to paint some of the some nocturnes. I'm trying to paint some pictures of the cliffs around Sydney, and in portraiture I'm doing a series of portraits of twins, identical twins. That's my next project. Anyway, thank you very much.
This painting is part of a series that I've been working on for over 2 years now, and I got involved in it when I was at COFA. It involves basically painting knitted fabric, in particular hand-knitted fabric, and I've become so engrossed in it that I'm now doing a research master's where I'm looking at the parallels between knitting and painting. I think both have materiality that's compelling, and even though you would predict that, you know, painting is allegedly dead as soon as the first photograph was taken, hand knitting should have died out a couple of centuries ago when machineries were invented, but people love practicing them and they love looking at them and feeling them in the case of knitting. So to go back to the beginning, though, I didn't set out to paint knitting. I was actually interested in pattern. I love the look of pattern. I think it's really delightful to look at, but I also see it as a way of a non-verbal language. We communicate with pattern, we read pattern. Some of it is culturally signified. Stripes, like big bold diagonal stripes on warnings around building sites. That sort of, you don't need to know, you almost intuitively know that that's what that means. Pinstripes mean something very different. Polka dots are different again. So that's where this originated from, was that interest in language as pattern as a communicator. I also like with pattern, it gets away from a lot of the compositional rules or practices of painting, because there's no logical end with pattern. There's no limit, like a still life is within a confined space, but pattern becomes a little like landscape because it just continues off. It just goes this way and that way. And I think also, not evident with this, but pattern can give you a sense of abundance, because you can imagine 1 dot or 100 dots. There's something very sort of cheerful and sense of abundance with pattern. So that's where my head was, and then I just came across knitting and thought, I'll tie those two together. It's a way of talking about pattern, and knitting is something that I used to do quite a bit of when I grew up in a little country town and there was not much else to do. So I understand it, I have an appreciation of it. It's also something that I feel some cultural attachment to. My mother taught me to knit, her mother taught her to knit, and I can imagine that women in my family have knitted for generations and probably the same patterns, and that I find quite appealing. I might, for my little bag of goodies, rather than paint, I've got knitting. When I first started looking at pattern, the pattern was in the actual different coloured wools, and I started knitting for the first time again in years, and the first few I did basically taking sections of stuff that I would knit up. And I was reasonably happy with that, but there was a limit to how much you could say. And then I started looking at pattern. I don't know what you can see from this distance, but pattern within the stitch. So, just the one colour wool. Can you see? But you get lovely indentations as well, things coming forward and back, more of a texture, shadows, and I think it emphasises the pattern, which was what the interest was. So yes, I got to the point then where I knit up a little patch, and this is actually this stitch. The title comes from the name of the stitch. It's called Ripple, and it's one of the most simple of all of the stitches. So you're probably wondering why I'm talking about pattern, because this is not too obvious a pattern. But I wanted, going back to the idea of pattern communicating, I wanted to communicate a sense of space, of calm, just really being able to slow down. When I started doing this research, I found that there is such a resurgence of knitting. If you go on the internet, there's all sorts of blogs, mostly quite young women, even some men are knitting, and it was really interesting that they were apologetic about the time that they were taking out of their lives to knit. And I think that's a problem that we all have. We're all so busy. To actually sit and knit, it used to be centuries ago something that people would do, it's a very practical, utilitarian thing. People would do it to make money. Now it's a luxury, because time is now a luxury. If you're just interested to know where I might be going from now, I'm now starting to look at lace patterns. So, and using the negative spaces within those patterns, because I have been painting in that style for a couple of years now. I need a bit of a break, so I'm doing works on paper and abstracting the pattern a lot more. So, for example, I put this over an overhead projected that onto a large sheet of paper, and then instead of drawing where the wool would be, I draw the negative spaces within the pattern. And I think as my work goes on, I just continually will be breaking that pattern up more and more and abstracting it more. My favourite style of painting is actually abstract, despite the early work I've done is quite illusionistic and realistic.
This painting is part of a series that I've done. There's about 5 in the series so far. It was inspired by my trip through Europe last year. And as I was walking around, I saw a lot of mythological creatures on building facades, obviously in museums, on table legs, pretty much everywhere. And I wasn't particularly drawn to the ones you most commonly see, for example, like St. Mark's Line in Venice, where it's like a huge line, big, well-proportioned wings, and it's a very impressive creature. And most of the ones I saw were either like that, or you get the opposite, which is like a gargoyle, which is like, you know what a gargoyle looks like. And I was more interested in the ones that are sort of in between the two, which you very occasionally see. Now, so it's semi-classical, but a bit awkward looking. For example, there was one in Pompeii, which was a table leg, and it consisted of a line with just one leg, a huge foot, a soccer ball sort of shaped body. And I'm not sure if it was the artist's intention, but his expression was somehow caught between a raw, kind of looked like he was laughing, kind of looked like he was crying. And I thought this was pretty unusual, and it inspired me. And so I got thinking, like, why do I have a greater affinity with these kind of stranger ones than the typical ones, the ones that are really impressive and majestic? And I thought, perhaps they just remind me of like a sort of regular people with their own traits and quirks, and perhaps their own personal conflicts that don't quite fit together perfectly. And so it inspired me to try and make some of my own. So I decided to try and base them on real people, sometimes friends, and maybe one of them is a self-portrait. This one isn't a self-portrait. Yeah, as you can see, or hopefully see, it's a very small lion's head placed on a swan. To me, the lion looks somewhat dejected and perhaps a little frustrated. Perhaps which is attached to a swan's body. So it's meant to sort of portray our person in some sort of conflict. Yeah, so you could see the lion as being a person with a sort of like a strong will, or perhaps needing some sort of power or lacking power, something to do with power. And the body is sort of more suited to like grace and flight and danger. Yeah, so overall he's just a conflicted person. That's what has an uneven temperament. So this is, as I said before, only a series of about 5, so I've been painting other things that are fairly different. I've done a series, or halfway through a series of double portraits. Some are of myself and others are involving artists of various scale put together. They're pretty much impossible to explain, but hopefully you'll see one eventually somewhere. I've also been painting pictures of interiors with people sort of holding sort of almost totemistic sort of animals on their laps. Overall, I'm interested in combining things that people often think are opposite. So I try, not in this one, but overall I try and bring together things such as beauty and sometimes the disturbing. Things like humour and sincerity, and just the everyday with the uncanny. So I try to bring them together because I often feel that they coexist in real life, so why should the painting be any different? I'll just talk a little bit about my technique. So what I try and get in a painting straight away is a sense of form, and By form I mean just roundness. It's often lacking in a lot of modern art. And you can see in this one the major form would be the wing there. So I try and find something that's got a lot of sort of solid form and get that in first, and that kind of sets the light for the picture. And then I try and paint the rest of the forms to fit in as closely as possible with the initial one that I painted. So I've tried to paint this area, which on my reference was different than that, to match in terms of the form of this area, so you have similar highlights, similar modelling of the form. I also try and have a sense of light, so I try and often keep one area slightly lighter, it's only subtle than the rest, so you have a sort of sense of a real light source that sort of starting to fade away towards the back. Often when I tell my friends my ideas for my paintings, they think they're quite ridiculous and they just laugh at me. And I sort of don't mind that because it gives me a challenge, but I try to get to it. I just like that sort of conflict where you've got something that's ridiculous sometimes, but you try and make it beautiful and make it so it seems, or it comes from a sincere place that has elements of other things put together. And so far it seems to have worked out. Thank you.
Yeah, firstly I just want to say I'm a full-time practicing artist, and I was born in Sydney, and I grew up in the northwest of Sydney in a place called Galston. My studio is currently at Glenorrey, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's about 5 minutes from Galston. So a lot of my work has been landscape based, but it's more influenced by the landscape than a pictorial reference. My education, I studied at National Art School. I then went and worked for the Australian Volunteers for 3 years in Thailand and decided to do an MFA in printmaking, only because the head of the university, the last hour, decided that he wasn't going to let international students into painting. But I think he did me a favour, and through printmaking I got to use all the facilities in every department. I stayed there for 2 years. But my placement, again, which is interesting, and you'll find that this is a common thread within my work, my first placement in Thailand was on the Lao-Cambodian-Thai border in a rural setting, and that's where my original drawings of the roosters started. So I was quite engaged with cockfighting and the divide between the females' roles in society and the males' roles in society in Thai society. So originally I started doing a lot of drawings and sort of actually doing a lot of what Tom does and going down but not, I was actually sitting with the people, but I was drawing from life and doing a lot of plein air work, and I subsequently showed that as my master's work called Diaries of Thailand. So my studio, as I said, it's in Glenorrey, on a beautiful rose farm. I also work for the people that I rent my studio from. They go to the Sydney Flower Market, so if any of you guys have been to the flower market, it's full of beautiful forms and great energy, but my time there is spent between 2 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock in the morning, 3 days a week. So I have very odd hours when I work in the studio. I work from about 6 o'clock in the evening to 2 o'clock till someone knocks on my studio door, which is in a beautiful big barn. They knock on the door and they tell me to get into a truck and go to work. So I kind of don't have a divide between my studio life, my working life, and I think my home life. It's all reflected within my work. after I came back from Thailand, this was sort of a crucial time in terms of my career, because I had a very good start when I left university. I showed at Couture Powerhouse. I was making quite abstract images, but I became very disconcerted about what it was I was trying to sort of say within my work. So I went to work with Australian volunteers and it made a huge impact. So when I came back to Australia, I went back to my parents' farm, which is, I'm the 5th generation in that area, and I started to explore the notion of objects as a vehicle to paint. So I looked at subjects like tractors and roosters and the physical landscape, but I always had in mind that most of the things were inanimate objects that could transcend what I wanted to say in paint, but also how I felt about a particular object or a particular time in my life. So most of my work is a reflection of my expressive emotions relating to objects, before my current work. So that sort of entertained me for the next sort of 4 or 5 years, and through a lot of hounding from my boss and my friends who sort of said, how can you live on a rose farm and not ever paint a rose? I think I became quite stubborn about it. I refused to paint a rose, I refused to paint a flower, and I refused to be told that I'm still like a painter. And then when the bubble burst, I really started to engage with the forms that I was working with, the colours that I work with. But I probably looked at it in a more symbolic way. So the new show that I'm going to have in a month is based on all these beautiful forms, yet the underlying nature of the show was in part to do with 2 friends that I've had this year pass away, and the first friend that passed away in a very freak accident stimulated me to start writing more, which I had done in the past, but I'd sort of put it down, but start actually write, when I started an image, to start the image by writing a text about how I felt about people that had left my life that I could no longer speak to. So that was a catalyst for this sort of period where this was one of the earlier images from the show. But the catalyst was this friend passing away, and then I started making more and more works that obviously the rose is a very elegant, romantic thing, but I use the sort of dark, moody backgrounds to kind of show the contradictions between sort of life and death. And then recently, sadly to say, a friend of mine who I was very close to just passed away, and I think it kind of reconfirmed what I was doing then, because I had the opportunity to see this person for about 2 weeks, just about every day, and something was holding me back. And yet when it happened, obviously we all think, oh, why didn't I stop? Why didn't I stop? So I've sort of continued in this vein of kind of writing to people within my work, and in the show there's a lot of work that has that actually has text that you can see, and then the image is placed over the top, combined with these very strong sort of forms. And I suppose to talk more directly about this particular image, I remember you as you were my beauty. I think that kind of transcends exactly what I said then about my friend. You know, and anyone that has had someone meaningful in their life, which we all have, pass away. I just thought that was a beautiful sentiment when it came to this painting. I often try and pick forms that will transcend the way in which I deliver paint. My background is actually, I studied horticulture for 4 years, at the same time I was a professional sportsman, and my wife I've often heard her say as I eavesdrop, when he's painting, it's like he's dancing in the studio, because I think I work a lot on adrenaline. I do a lot of drawing and a lot of prep for the paintings, and I try and sort of place the form within the dimensions that I'm working. But when it comes to actually painting, it's quite explosive, and I paint every day, but there's so many days that don't work when you paint like that way, and there's so much paint that doesn't end up on the canvas, it ends up on my studio floor, which Julie mentioned earlier. The sculptures actually came about because of the studio floor, because I got sick of seeing all that waste. I thought there's got to be something that I can do with that waste, and at the time I was working with a local guy who's from the hardware, but he happens to be a taxidermist as well, and we kind of got this kooky relationship where I'll go to the hardware and say, have you got any owl eyes? And he'll say, yeah, just come around this afternoon, you know. So, and you know, you get to his place and he'll say, oh, come in here, go in the back room, and there's always weird animals, like things that you don't really need to see. And he tries to tell me how my sculptures aren't valid because they're not right. But my idea was that I was going to use all the discarded material. I mean, obviously for him, he's going to use the real thing. So we're in contradiction again, which is, it's kind of how my work works. There's a push and pull within the work that creates a tension. When it really works, I hope it creates a tension that the viewer can actually engage with, whether they like it, dislike it. There's an emotion there that they can respond to, whether it's moody, whether it's beautiful, whether it's macabre. And in the sculptures it is macabre. I mean, the idea for me of using the animals is to sort of use this discarded waste, recycle it, and kind of create it gives me a chance to sort of explore the darker side of my work. So often when I have in this upcoming show, I will have an installation of paintings, but I will actually have a room which is an installation of kind of kooky taxidermy sculptures, and I often feel like I should have the photograph of my friend standing there in his stubbies that sells me owl eyes.